With 3 weeks to go until Election Day and a tight race for who will form the next government, the Assembly of First Nations found that First Nations voters could help decide the outcome in 36 ridings. 19 of those have a First Nations electorate of 10% or more. So with that type of voting power, there are growing conversations about the lack of focus on Indigenous issues in the campaign thus far. Indigenous Watchdog tracks the progress on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action. That, as a reminder, was released back in 2015. A decade later, 14 of those calls are completed, work on 22 haven't started, and 19 calls are stalled. 46 are reported to be still in progress. So for a closer look this morning at the issues and specifics yet to be addressed by the federal leaders, we're joined by Sheila North, former MKO Grand Chief, and Cassidy Caron, Principal Consultant at First Peoples Group and former Métis National Council President. Good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Good morning. Trump and tariffs have been dominant in this campaign, but we know that across the board, affordability is still a top concern in every riding in this country. Statistics Canada released a survey of Indigenous people in January, and 45% of First Nations, 44% of Métis, and 54% of Inuit living off-reserve said it was difficult or very difficult to pay for necessary expenses this past year. We're talking housing and food. Sheila, how are First Nations experiencing the rising cost of living?
Well, as you just stated some statistics there, we're used to this kind of level of living here in our own country. So we're starting to see other people feel it and complain about it, but we've been living like this for a long time, many of our people, and it's getting worse.
The intensity of the affordability crisis is ratcheting up. Cassidy, what about affordability concerns facing the Métis?
Absolutely. So, throughout this election, we're listening and we're hearing a lot, mostly specifically about the tariff war and talking about resource development, resource extraction. What we're not hearing about is closing those socioeconomic gaps that still exist between the Métis Nation and all Canadians. And so that's a critical issue that we're still listening for throughout this election that we just have yet to hear.
Sheila, you bumped into Liberal leader Mark Carney last week, and you tracked him down. You said you talked to him, about how treaties and tariffs are, what you said, interrelated. What does that connection look like for people who may not know?
Well, I think we all know that, if we don't all know by now, treaties are very much inherent to the building of this nation. Without our treaties, Canada wouldn't be what it is, and it's what's holding it together at the end of the day. And so if they're going to start imposing tariffs back and forth, First Nations treaty and inherent rights need to be there as well represented, because they already are. When they talk about natural resources and extraction, they're inherently talking about our rights. And so we're going to have to get to the point where we deal with the inherent and treaty rights at some point when you talk about tariffs and this economic crisis. So we might as well get on the same table now, because it's going to happen. It's inevitable.
Party leaders, we know, are highlighting their plans to beef up Canada's defence and resource development, as you just mentioned, Sheila. These are pledges that directly affect Indigenous communities. And Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre just outlined them both. He's promising a national energy corridor that would include pre-approved pipelines. Liberal leader Mark Carney says he's going to increase Canada's military presence in the Arctic, promising billions to do that. Cassidy, what commitments are you looking for to ensure Indigenous people are part of those decisions?
So when we hear those large campaign promises, what's missing right now is language around commitment to working with rights holders, and specifically distinctions-based language. So, when we're talking in the North, we want to be hearing the language around working directly with Inuit leaders. We want to be hearing the language around working with First Nations leaders, and we want to hear the language around working with Métis leaders. And so when we're talking about resource extraction, there needs to be that commitment to working with rights holders. When the next government is formed, Indigenous leaders across this country want to know that the leader of this country understands the difference between working directly with rights holders, Indigenous rights holders, versus us as stakeholders or an interest group or just those with the loudest voice. It's critical that the next leader of this country understands that Indigenous peoples in this country have rights, and they need to be at the table at that level.
The party leaders, as we mentioned, have just 3 more weeks to earn the votes from Indigenous communities. New analysis from the census data from the Assembly of First Nations. We said this off the top. Whoever ends up winning in this election in 36 ridings could be decided by First Nations voters. So, Sheila, I'll start with you. Which party are you most confident in to advance the issues we talked about today? There has been concern and precedent in the past of concern from both of these parties, the Conservative and the Liberals, and how they've related to Indigenous communities.
Well, as a fellow journalist, I try to maintain that neutrality, and I try very, very desperately to do that. But I also have to think about the good of our people, and you know, I hope that all 3 parties make large and bold commitments to work with Indigenous people, because that's what we're all looking for. I think we're still missing that. We're still getting to that point, and it's also upon us as Indigenous people and leaders to make noise and to be heard. It's not the same as it was when it was in 2015, when you saw a huge rallying of the Indigenous vote, Indigenous voices. Mm-hmm. But that was also at the same time when the Conservatives were making, you know, threatening, I guess, our rights and inherent rights to our lands and the way that we govern. And so there was a pushback against that, and Liberals spoke to the Indigenous people at that time, and great numbers turned out. It doesn't feel the same right now because of the what's going on south of the border and its influence on this election. But I think it's going to pick up because we're seeing more and more people engaged, and we're definitely smarter at you know, finding out who is actually saying what.
Yeah, Cassie, how about yourself?
Yeah, again, you know, I take a nonpartisan approach right now. Again, just as Sheila said, we're not hearing really anything as it relates to Indigenous issues in this country, good or bad right now. So it's hard to form those alliances and make those decisions just based specifically on that. But there are 3 weeks left in this election. And as you said, Anne-Marie, you know, the First Nations create one of the largest voter populations. But when you take into consideration the numbers of Métis voters as well, who have historically been extremely civically engaged, and Inuit, either collectively or individually, you know, our populations can swing ridings. So it's really important that the leaders understand what is most important to us when they're continuing their campaign across this country, to go out and meet with Indigenous leaders to understand what those issues are. We saw Prime Minister Carney, right before the elections dropped, or the writs dropped for the election, meet with the 3 national Indigenous leaders. That's promising, but we've yet to see any of that engagement from any of the leaders of the parties throughout this election. There's still 3 weeks left, so we're hoping that they hear this message, and we'll start engaging with Indigenous peoples and understand, you know, tariff war is important. Closing socioeconomic gaps, equally important for our people. How are they going to do that? We want to see that language reflected in their election campaigns.
As you both wisely point out, party actions of the past, we have 2 new leaders of these parties, so it is an open conversation. Sheila and Cassidy, I want to just end on reconciliation, which is the top of the list for the AFN's suggested list of topics that are important to Indigenous peoples. What should the next government, whoever it is, take to move towards reconciliation? What language does that look like and sound like to you? I'll start with you, Sheila.
I think the old adage of nothing about us without us is a good summary of what needs to happen, because we should be at the table when decisions are being made about our people. I think we're getting closer to that, but it usually happens after, you know, a court case. It comes with it, because government sometimes only listens to outcomes of court cases, but we shouldn't have to get to that point. Treaties were meant to have shared access to resources and lands and shared responsibility and a relationship. And we need to remind ourselves what those are, because it's not, you know, being better or having somebody have more than the other. It's equal rights to the lands and resources that Creator has blessed us with on these lands. So I think the more that we remind ourselves of what those actually mean, the less scared we will be of what treaties actually mean.
And Cassidy, for you?
I wholeheartedly agree with Sheila. You know, reconciliation is the co-development of what this country looks like moving forward versus having to take our issues to court to be taken seriously. So again, in like concrete action. What that looks like is a strong understanding that Indigenous peoples in this country are rights holders. We are not stakeholders. We are not an advocacy group. We are not interest holders. We are rights holders, and we need to be at the table to be able to co-develop what is needed to be able to move this country forward in a good way.
Sheila North, former MKO Grand Chief, and Cassidy Caron, Principal Consultant at First Peoples Group and former Métis National Council President. A pleasure to have this conversation with the both of you today. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
If you like that video, make sure to subscribe to the Your Morning YouTube feed, where you can find all kinds of new content posted every weekday morning.